Stop scrolling for a second, because something just happened that completely cracks the story people think they know. For months, the narrative around Shedeur Sanders has been loud, confident, and suspiciously one-sided. You've heard it everywhere. Too arrogant, too flashy, too much baggage, too much noise. The kind of labels that spread fast, stick hard, and rarely get questioned. But today, that story took a direct hit. Not from a media personality, not from a viral clip, from inside the locker room. One of Shedeur's own teammates stepped up and said the quiet part out loud, that the version of Shedeur being pushed online doesn't match reality at all. That the guy critics love to tear down is actually respected, approachable, and fully in the mix with his teammates. No diva behavior, no detachment, just a quarterback doing his job. And that matters more than any hot take ever could. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Narratives don't survive contact with people who were actually there. They survive clicks. They survive repetition. They survive when no one challenges them. And the moment someone from the inside speaks, the whole thing starts to wobble. That's why this moment feels different. This isn't about defending a player blindly. It's about asking why so many people felt comfortable judging a man they've never met, based on assumptions they never verified. Confidence got translated into arrogance. Visibility got turned into entitlement. And his last name became the easiest shortcut for criticism. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Because this story isn't just about Shedeur. It's about how narratives get built in football and who they're built for. It's about why some quarterbacks are called leaders for the same traits others get punished for. And it's about how quickly a storyline collapses when real voices finally cut through the noise. Now layer this on top of what's happening in Cleveland Browns, with new leadership, new direction, and a franchise desperate for clarity at quarterback. And suddenly, this isn't just a character discussion anymore. It's a turning point. Because once the locker room speaks, the narrative doesn't belong to the critics anymore. And what comes next is going to make a lot of people very uncomfortable. The loudest voice in this story didn't come from a studio, a timeline, or a headline. It came from the locker room. And that's what changed everything. While analysts and commentators have spent months debating Shedeur Sanders from a distance, one of his own teammates stepped forward and cut straight through the noise. No agenda, no branding, just someone who actually shared the room, the work, and the grind. What he said mattered, because it contradicted almost every accusation floating around online. According to that teammate, Shedeur wasn't isolated. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't some detached star acting above the group. He was present. He was engaged. He was in the mix, talking to everyone, connecting with everyone, and earning respect the old-fashioned way. The exact opposite of the caricature that's been pushed so aggressively. That's not a small detail. In football, locker room credibility is currency. Teammates don't go out of their way to defend someone unless they mean it. Silence is easy. Neutrality is common. Public defense, that's rare, especially when the narrative is already stacked against you. And here's what really stands out. If Shedeur was the problem critics claim he is, this moment never happens. Teammates don't risk their own reputation to protect someone who doesn't deserve it. They don't volunteer praise if there's resentment bubbling underneath. The absence of teammate criticism over time matters just as much as this one statement. But narratives don't care about that. They care about optics. They care about clips. They care about feeding an audience something familiar enough to believe without questioning. And once a label sticks, it becomes easier to repeat it than to verify it. That's why this testimony landed so hard. It forced a contrast between two realities, the one built by people who have never been in the room, and the one described by someone who lived in it. And when those two realities collide, the audience has to choose which one deserves more weight. This doesn't mean Shedeur is perfect. No quarterback is. But it does mean the character attacks deserve a second look. Because when the people closest to a player tell a completely different story than the critics, it exposes a gap that can't be ignored. And once that gap opens, everything that follows starts to feel shaky. Because if the foundation of the criticism is wrong, then the conclusions built on top of it might be too. And that raises an even bigger question. Where did this narrative come from in the first place? The arrogant label didn't appear overnight. It was built slowly, piece by piece, until it felt familiar enough to stop questioning. That's how these things usually work. With Shedeur Sanders, the narrative didn't start with anything he said in a locker room or did on a field. It started with optics, cameras, clips, confidence framed without context. Once that image was set, everything else was filtered through it. Confidence became entitlement. Calm became smugness. Visibility became ego. And from there, the story practically wrote itself. The problem is, football culture has always struggled with this distinction. When certain quarterbacks speak with certainty, they're called poised. When others do the exact same thing, they're labeled difficult. The difference isn't behavior, it's perception. And perception is shaped by who's telling the story. Shedeur became an easy target because he didn't fit the familiar mold. He didn't downplay expectations. He didn't pretend the spotlight wasn't there. And he didn't shrink himself to make other people comfortable. That confidence was interpreted as arrogance long before anyone bothered to check whether it showed up in the locker room. And that's where the disconnect begins. Most of the loudest critics have never been around Shedeur. They've never shared a practice, never sat in meetings, never watched how teammates respond to him when cameras are off. Yet the label stuck because it was convenient. It gave people a shortcut, a way to explain discomfort without doing real work. Add his last name into the equation, and the narrative accelerated. Being the son of Shedeur Sanders meant every action was amplified. Confidence wasn't just confidence, it was nepotism. Support wasn't just parenting, it was interference. The same traits celebrated in other football families suddenly became suspect here. That double standard didn't start with Shedeur, but it found fertile ground around him. And here's the most revealing part. The arrogant label never came with receipts. No teammates speaking out. No coaches hinting at issues. No pattern of behavior to point to. Just repetition. And repetition, when loud enough, starts to feel like truth. Until someone from the inside speaks. That's why the teammate testimony hit so hard. It didn't just defend Shedeur, it exposed how thin the narrative really was. When the people closest to a player describe him as grounded, approachable, and respected, the caricature starts to collapse. And once that happens, you're forced to ask a harder question. If the arrogant story was built on optics instead of evidence, what else in this conversation has been exaggerated to fit a storyline? Because narratives don't fall apart quietly. They crack first. This is where the criticism stops being subtle and starts revealing its real shape. Because the backlash around Shedeur Sanders has never been just about him. It has always circled back to his father, Shedeur Sanders. And that's where the double standard becomes impossible to ignore. The narrative goes like this: Shedeur is too involved, too visible, too vocal, too present. And by extension, his son must be entitled, manufactured, or propped up. It's a storyline that sounds reasonable on the surface, until you compare it to how the league has treated other football families. Take the Mannings. When Peyton Manning and Eli Manning were coming up, their father Archie Manning was deeply involved. He guided decisions, helped shape paths, used his knowledge and leverage to put his sons in the best possible positions. And that wasn't criticized, it was celebrated. It was called smart parenting. It was called preparation. It was called football royalty. But when Shedeur does the same thing, advocating for his son, protecting his development and making sure the system fits, the tone changes completely. Suddenly, it's framed as interference, as ego, as a problem that needs to be managed. That contrast matters, because the action itself isn't different, the response to it is. Dayan isn't forcing opportunities that don't exist. He's not asking teams to ignore the tape. He's doing what elite fathers in elite football families have always done, using experience to help the next generation navigate a ruthless industry. The only difference is how comfortable people are admitting that when the father looks like him. And that discomfort bleeds into how Shedeur is evaluated. Confidence becomes manufactured. Success becomes handed to him. Leadership becomes entitlement. None of that lines up with the evidence on the field or in the locker room. But it fits a narrative people are already primed to believe. And once that narrative takes hold, it stops being about football and starts being about optics. That's why this moment feels so important. Because when you strip away the labels, the situation isn't complicated. A father is doing what fathers with power and knowledge have always done in football. A son is carrying himself with confidence in a sport that demands it. The problem isn't involvement. The problem is who gets permission to be involved without being punished for it. And once you see that, it becomes harder to unsee, especially when the conversation keeps pretending this is just about quarterback play. Here's the part of the conversation that keeps getting quietly skipped. Before the narratives, before the debates, before the labels ever stuck, there was a paper trail. And that trail doesn't line up with the way Shedeur Sanders is talked about today. Because if Shedeur was truly overhyped, if the talent wasn't real, if the confidence was empty, the offer list would tell that story immediately. It doesn't. Coming out of high school, Shedeur didn't receive fringe interest or courtesy looks. He was pursued by the gatekeepers of college football, programs that don't gamble, programs that don't care about last names, programs whose entire business model is evaluating quarterbacks correctly. Alabama offered, Georgia offered, Michigan offered, Oregon offered, Florida State offered, Baylor offered. These aren't brand name scholarships handed out for optics. These are programs built on ruthless evaluation. If you can't play, you don't get in the room, period. That's what makes the current criticism feel disconnected from reality. Because none of those staffs were guessing. They weren't recruiting a project. They weren't doing favors for a famous father. They were watching film, breaking down mechanics, evaluating processing speed, and projecting growth. And they all came to the same conclusion: Shedeur was worth the investment. That's not hype, that's consensus. Yet somehow, years later, the conversation has shifted as if this pedigree never existed. As if the evaluations that mattered most suddenly became irrelevant once the narrative changed. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because the offers didn't disappear, the tape didn't vanish, the production didn't fall off a cliff. What changed was the storyline surrounding him. One omission from that list gets brought up constantly, and it's often framed as proof. But one school not offering doesn't outweigh half a dozen elite programs saying yes. Recruiting isn't unanimous by design. Styles differ, needs differ, philosophies clash. That's normal. What isn't normal is pretending that widespread elite interest never happened. And here's the key point most people miss. Offer lists age better than opinions. Takes evolve. Narratives flip. But evaluations from championship-level staffs at the moment of projection are hard to dismiss without rewriting history. So when people question whether Shedeur belongs in serious conversations about the future, they're not arguing against hype. They're arguing against evidence. And once you acknowledge that, the debate shifts. Because this stops being about whether he's qualified and starts being about why so many people are suddenly uncomfortable admitting that he always was. And that raises the next question. If the talent was never the issue, why was the narrative so easy to sell? This is where the conversation gets quieter and more interesting. Because once you line everything up, there's a connection people keep circling without fully saying out loud. Not because it's proven, not because it's official, but because it makes too much sense to ignore. Let's be clear up front. There is no public confirmation that Todd Monken was hired because of Shedeur Sanders. No press release, no direct quote, no on-the-record admission. But football decisions aren't made in press conferences. They're made in meeting rooms. And when you look at the overlap, the alignment starts to stand out. Years before Cleveland entered this current crossroads, Monken was running offenses built around timing, structure, and quarterback autonomy. His systems thrive when the quarterback can process quickly, stay calm under pressure, and control the offense from the pocket. That's not speculation, that's on tape. Now layer in this detail that often gets brushed past. Monken was at Georgia during the same window when Shedeur was being evaluated and offered by elite programs. That doesn't mean a deal was made. It doesn't mean a promise existed. But it does mean familiarity was established early. And familiarity matters in the NFL. Coaches don't forget evaluations. They don't forget film rooms. They don't forget quarterbacks who stood out during projection stages, especially quarterbacks who later proved those evaluations right. That's why some around the league have quietly suggested, not confirmed, but suggested, that this hire reflects fit more than coincidence. Fit between philosophy and player type. Fit between offensive vision and quarterback temperament. And here's the key part. Cleveland didn't just hire a play caller, they hired a builder. Monken's reputation isn't about gimmicks or trends. It's about installing systems that work when the spotlight is hottest. Systems that protect quarterbacks instead of exposing them. Systems that demand command, not just arm talent. That matters if you're even considering a quarterback like Shedeur in your long-term planning. So no, this isn't a smoking gun. It's a pattern of philosophical alignment, a pattern of shared football values, a pattern that suggests Cleveland is thinking beyond noise and toward structure. And when organizations start thinking that way, it usually means they're preparing for something bigger than the current conversation. Because coaches like Monken don't take jobs just to manage chaos. They take them when they believe the pieces can fit. And whether that fit ultimately includes Shedeur is still unfolding, but the direction of the thinking is already clear. And that's what makes this moment impossible to ignore. There's a trait scouts rarely measure correctly, but players recognize instantly when it's missing. They call it cool, not style, not flash, not confidence for the cameras. Real cool is what shows up when the pocket collapses, the crowd turns hostile, and the moment starts speeding up. It's the ability to stay grounded when everything around you is trying to pull you out of rhythm. That's why this conversation around Shedeur Sanders keeps missing the point. When teammates describe him as calm, approachable, and steady, they're not complimenting his personality for fun. They're identifying a quarterback trait that doesn't show up on stat sheets but decides games. Because panic spreads fast in football, and so does composure. Look around the league. The quarterbacks who separate themselves aren't always the loudest or the most emotional. They're the ones who look the same on 3rd and long as they do in warm-ups. The ones whose heartbeat doesn't spike when the margin for error disappears. That's why players gravitate toward them. Cool keeps an offense functional when protection breaks down. It keeps receivers confident after a drop. It keeps a huddle intact when momentum swings. And that's exactly why locker room voices matter so much here. When teammates say Shedeur is in the mix, always talking, always connected, that's leadership in its purest form. Not speeches, not slogans, presence. The kind that builds trust snap by snap. This is where outside criticism usually gets it wrong. People mistake calm for arrogance. They mistake control for detachment. And when a quarterback doesn't perform vulnerability for public consumption, they assume there's something missing. But the game doesn't reward performance, it rewards execution. Quarterbacks like Joe Burrow and Patrick Mahomes aren't respected because they talk louder than everyone else. They're respected because nothing rattles them. Teammates know exactly who they're getting, every single snap. That's the through line. And it's why this cool label shouldn't be dismissed as soft praise. It's functional. It translates. It's one of the few traits that survives the jump from college to the NFL without needing adjustment, especially in markets where pressure is constant and patience is thin. So when people downplay that quality, they're not being critical, they're being short-sighted. Because the league is full of talented quarterbacks who couldn't survive chaos. Arm strength didn't save them. Scheme didn't save them. Composure would have. And once you recognize that, the conversation around Shedeur shifts again. Because talent opens the door. But cool is what keeps you in the building when everything starts to shake. If it feels like the criticism around Shedeur Sanders has gotten louder lately, that's not your imagination. Backlash doesn't spike when someone is failing. It spikes when people sense they might be wrong. That's the part rarely acknowledged out loud. Early narratives are easy. You plant a label, repeat it enough times, and let momentum do the rest. But narratives get fragile the moment reality starts pushing back. Teammates speak up. Tape keeps validating. Opportunities don't disappear. And suddenly, the story requires more effort to maintain. That's when the volume goes up. Because for critics, quiet doubt is worse than loud dismissal. If Shedeur simply struggled, the conversation would move on naturally. But that hasn't happened. Instead, the pushback has forced a recalibration, and not everyone is comfortable admitting they misread the situation. There's also a timing factor at play. As decision-makers start looking ahead, conversations shift from hypotheticals to consequences. When organizations begin aligning coaches, systems, and philosophies, speculation turns into pressure. And pressure exposes who was speaking from confidence versus who was speaking from assumption. That's why the tone has sharpened. What used to be framed as concern now sounds defensive. What used to be just questions starts repeating the same talking points louder instead of deeper. Because once a player survives the first wave of criticism, the next wave usually isn't about evaluation, it's about justification. And that's where fear enters the equation. If Shedeur succeeds, it won't just prove supporters right. It will force a lot of people to revisit their earlier takes, not privately, publicly. And in an industry built on authority and perception, being wrong on a high-profile quarterback isn't a small thing. Especially when the criticism wasn't about mechanics or scheme, but about character. That's a harder walk back. So the backlash gets louder. The skepticism gets broader. The framing gets more abstract. Instead of "he can't do this," it becomes "we'll see." Instead of "he lacks that," it turns into "the situation matters." Not because those points are invalid, but because they're safer. They leave room to pivot later. And that's what makes this moment so revealing. The noise isn't rising because Shedeur is fatting. It's rising because the window to dismiss him outright is closing. When teammates defend him, when coaches align with his strengths, when the conversation shifts from if to when, resistance naturally hardens before it breaks. That's not unique to him. That's human behavior. And now, with pressure building and timelines tightening, the story is entering its most uncomfortable phase, the one where outcomes start replacing opinions. Because once results enter the picture, volume stops mattering. Only accuracy does. And that's exactly why what happens next carries so much weight. This is where everything stops being theoretical. Because Shedeur Sanders isn't just another name cycling through the football news machine anymore. He's become a test case, not just for Cleveland, not just for scouts, but for the way the sport tells stories about players before their careers even begin. For years, the Cleveland Browns have been trapped in the same loop. New quarterback, new narrative, same ending, talent blamed, systems ignored, and eventually a reset that pretends the last one never happened. What makes this moment different is that the excuses are running out. When teammates defend a player publicly, it challenges the character narrative. When elite programs once validated his talent, it challenges the skill narrative. When coaches with proven track records align philosophically, it challenges the coincidence narrative. At some point, you're no longer critiquing football. You're protecting a storyline. That's why this pairing, this timing, and this moment matter so much. Because if Shedeur succeeds, it won't just confirm what supporters believed. It will force a reckoning with how quickly confidence was framed as arrogance, how involvement was framed as entitlement, and how narratives were built without evidence because they were easy to sell. And if he struggles, then the league has to answer a different question, whether it actually learned anything from the decades of quarterbacks it failed before him. Because talent doesn't collapse in a vacuum, development does. This is the part people don't like sitting with. If Shedeur wins, Cleveland looks like it finally broke the cycle. If he loses, it won't just be on his shoulders. It will expose every decision that surrounded him. That's the weight of this moment. This isn't about crowning a savior. It's about whether football culture can allow a confident, composed, highly visible quarterback to grow without tearing him down for not fitting a comfortable mold. Because the irony is simple. The traits people criticize now, calm, certainty, presence, are the same traits they praise once a quarterback starts winning. The difference is timing, and timing has always been the most unfair variable in this sport. So as the noise gets louder, remember this. Narratives don't decide careers. Organizations do. And the question hanging over Cleveland isn't whether Shedeur Sanders is ready. It's whether the league and the people telling his story are ready to admit they might have been wrong. Because once results replace opinions, there's no editing the tape. And this time, everyone will be watching.